Good afternoon, friends. I, Dr. Devesh Bandil, Associate Professor, Suresh Gyan, Vihar University, accredited by NAC A grade. Today, I will discuss about entity and attributes. You know, entity, and attribute is useful in your entity relationship diagram, entity relationship model, and entity relationship model. Through the relationship model, you can define the whole enterprise. That's why your entity and your attributes, both terms are useful in your entity relationship model. And in this lecture, I will discuss about entity, and also I will discuss about the attributes. Now I am presenting my screen. I hope you can see my screen. In this lecture, I will cover so many topics like your object and outcome of this lecture. What is entity? What are the types of your entity? What is attribute and your types of your attributes? You know, your entity and your attributes, both terms are used in your database management system. You know, database management, where you will store the data in your organized manner. This is your DBMS. And after studied the DBMS, student will able to how to apply the normalization in your database, how to apply the all relation algebra operation, how to apply the uh, all relations. Okay, and here I will discuss about the only object and outcome of your entity and your attribute. Object of this lecture is your understand concept of your entity and your attributes, and outcomes to be able to understand concept of your entity, and to be able to all types of understand concept of your attributes. And now I am talking about what is entity. Entity is a person, place, or thing. And also you can say that and the entity is a real world thing which can be distinctly identified like a person, place, or a concept. Entity who have some characteristics, who have some features, is your entity. It is an object which is distinguished from the others. you know Features, who have some features is your entity, who have some characteristics is your entity. Like your student is your entity. Teacher is your entity. Table is your entity, because all have some characteristics, all have some features. Like your student have some features. Features are student name, student age, student father name, student mother name, student sister name, student course, student college, student books, etc., etc. So these are the all features of your entity. These are the all characteristics of your entity that is your student. And in a same way, if we will talk about the teacher, teacher is also your entity, because teacher have age, teacher have date of joining, teacher characteristic is that your teacher pin card number, teacher Aadhaar card number, etc., etc. So means who have some characteristics, who have some features is your entity. Like your table, table is your entity. Table diameter, table thickness, table cost. So these are the all attributes of your table entity, right? If we cannot distinguish it from the others, then it is an object but not an entity. If you can't distinguish from the other, so means it is an object, not is an entity. You know, entity, like your tangible entity and your intangible entity. Your tangible entity, tangible entity are those entities which exist in your real world. Tangible entities are those entities which exist in the real world. For example, your person, car is your tangible entity, because these are existing in your real world. And in your intangible entity, in your intangible entities are those entities which exist only logical and have no physical existence, is called the logical entity. For example, bank account is your intangible entity. So means your entity may be a tangible entity, may be an intangible entity. Your tangible entity which exists means your tangible entity will exist in your real world, like your car, like your person is your tangible entity. And intangible entity which exist not logically, have no physical, means your intangible entity will exist logically but no physically. For example, your bank account, etc. For example, if we had table of your student, suppose I am taking a table, and I am taking a table of the student, and the attributes are roll number, student name, age, mobile number. Then each student in that table is an entity. You know, roll number, student of a table, and roll number, student name, age, mobile number. Then each student in that table is an entity and can be uniquely identified by their roll number. You know, in your student table, suppose there are so many students are existing, and the students field are like your student name, student father name, student roll number, student enrollment number, etc., etc. So means your each student is your entity in this table, and also can be uniquely identified by their roll number. If you know about the roll number of your student, so through the roll number you can identify the student, because your roll number is unique. Like another example, suppose if you are having a employee table, so you, and in your employee table there are so many employees are existing, and your fields of employee are employee name, employee father name, employee date of birth, employee registration, employee ID, employee PAN card, employee Aadhaar card. So through the employee PAN card, that is your field, and through the employee Aadhaar card, that is your also field, and through the Aadhaar card and PAN card field of your employee, you can identify the particular employee, because your PAN card is unique and your Aadhaar card is unique, and through the PAN card and your Aadhaar card, you can uh, identify the particular employee. I had mentioned an example of your student table. So you can see in this slide, student is your table name, and this table having four attributes. This table having four columns. First is your roll number, second is your student name, and third is your age, and fourth is your mobile number. Okay, so you can see student is your table, and these are the all entities: Android, Angle, Priya, and your Analysha. Okay, so I had mentioned in your rectangle, this is your entity, and after discuss about the entity, I will discuss about the entity type. Entity type means the entity type is a collection of the entity having similar attributes. The entity type is the collection of the entity having the similar attributes. Means if your entities having the similar attributes, so this is your entity type. In the above student table example, we have each row is an entity. As per I had told, look my previous slide. In this given slide, your each are the entity, like your Android, Angle, Priya, and your Anesla. Okay. So in the above student table, we have each row of an entity and they are having common attributes. You have already seen that in this above table, that is your student table, your all entity having the similar attributes, and each row has its own value for attributes like your roll number, age, student name, and your mobile number. So we can define the above student table is an entity type because it is a collection of entities having the same attributes. You know, if we will talk about the entity type, if your all entities having the similar types of attributes, that is your entity type. Okay, as per I had told, entity type is a collection of the entity having the similar attributes. And in the above my student table, all are the entities, and all entities having the similar types of attributes. That is your entity type. And so an entity type in an ER diagram is defined via name, here student, and a set of attributes are roll number, student name, age, and your mobile number. And like for example, for the if you want to draw the ER diagram of any enterprise, so suppose your person is your table, and your attributes of persons are person name, person father name, person address, person city, etc., and etc. And this above table so the how the data as different entities are stored. You know, in this slide I had introduced a new word, ER diagram. So you know, ER diagram, that is your entity relationship diagram, and I had already discussed in my previous lectures about the ER diagram. Here I am giving the only overview of ER diagram. E means entity, R means relation and diagram. Entity relationship diagram means where you will show the all entities and all relationship which are exist in your entity. This is your ER diagram, and through the ER diagram you can define the whole over enterprise through the entity relationship diagram. Like in this PPT, student is your table, and roll number, student name, age and mobile number. These are the all attributes of this table, that is your student. Okay, in this given slide, entity student is your entity type, because this table having the entity type, this table having the same type of records, like your every record have the uh, attribute roll number, student name, age and your mobile number. And also I had mentioned in this given slide is your entity. So means Engel is your entity, Priya is your entity, Andrew is your entity, and your Annalisa is your entity. And now I am discussing about the types of your entity. Types of your entity. There are two types of your entity. First is your strong entity type, and second is your weak entity type. And I will discuss all types of your entity one by one. First, I will discuss about the strong entity. Strong entity and the weak entity, both are types of your entity. Strong entity are those entity which has a key attribute. The primary key help in identifying each entity uniquely. Primary key is a new word. Primary key, primary key is, primary key is the attribute or more than attribute through which you can identify a particular record is your primary key. Like your suppose your one record is your employee, and your employee attributes are employee name, employee father's name, employee address, employee city, employee PIN card, and your employee ID. Okay, these are the all attributes of your employee record. So you can make the employee ID, because employee id as your primary key, because through the employee id you can identify the particular employee. And also you can employee id and your employee pin card number and employee other card number, means you can use both as your primary key, because through the both attributes you can identify a particular employee, because your employee id will unique and your employee other card and employee pin card will be unique. Okay, so your strong entity are those entity which has a key attribute, and the primary key help in identifying each entity uniquely. It is represented by a rectangle. A strong entity will always represent in your rectangle. जैसे like your student is your entity, so your student will represent in your rectangular way. In the above example, roll number identify each element of the table uniquely, and hence because in your school roll number is unique, and we can say the student is your strong entity type. Okay, so strong entity means which has a key attribute. Okay, and now I am talking about the example of your entity. You can see in this given slide, Student is your strong entity type, and the attributes are roll number, ID, mobile number, gender, name, and your age. Your roll number ID is your key attribute, because this attribute you can identify a particular student. That's why your student is your strong entity type. And now I'm talking about the weak entity. Weak entity weak entity type does not have a key attribute. Means in your weak entity type does not have a key attribute. Weak entity type can't be identify on its own. And also you can say that about a weak entity, if your one entity is depend on your another entity, is called the weak entity. And as per I had told, weak entity type cannot be identified on its own. It depends upon the other strong entity for its distinct identifier. As per I had told, if your one entity is depend on another entity, it's called the weak entity. This can be understood with a real life example. There can be a children only if the parent exists. There can be a no independent existence of your children. There can be a room only if building exists. There can be no independent existence of your room. A weak entity represented by a double outline rectangle, and where your strong entity is represented through a rectangle, and your weak entity is represented in your double outline rectangle. A weak entity is represented our double outline rectangle, and the relationship between a weak entity type and your strong entity type is called a identifying relationship, and shown with a double outline diamond instead on a single outline diamond. Okay, means if you will define the relationship between a strong entity and your weak entity, so your relationship will define in your double outline diamond shape. For example, if we have two tables of your customers, customer ID, name, mobile number, age, and your gender, and address, locality, town, state, customer ID. Here we cannot identify the address uniquely, as there can be many customers from the same locality. So for this we need an attribute of strong entity type, that is your customer, here to uniquely identify entities of your address entity type. And now I am taking an example of your, where you will define I will define the relationship between your strong entity type and your weak entity type. And you can understand through this example about your strong entity and about your weak entity. In your strong entity type, customer is your strong entity type, and the attributes are mobile number, customer ID, age, head, gender, and your name. And your weak entity is your address, because your address is dependent on your customer. Okay, and your address is your big entity, and the attributes of this big entities are town, locality, and your state. And I had shown the relationship between customer and your address is that your hedge. And now I will discuss about the entity set. You know, entity set, what is the entity set? Entity set is the collection of your similar type entities. Your same type your entities is your entity set. In the above example, I had taken student is your entity type. A collection of entities from the student type would from an entity set. The main key point of your entity set is the collection of your same type of your entity. For example, in a blue example, your two entities E1 and your E2, and your E1 attributes are 2 angle 19 this phone number, and your E2 entity also have the attributes of 4 ancilla this from an entity set. You can see in this table. You can see in this table, student student is your entity type, because in this student table all entities are of similar types. That's why your student is your entity type. Okay, and your entity set E1 and your E2. Your E1 your even is your record have the same types of your attribute, like your two roll number, student name, age, and your mobile number. And in the same manner, e2 e2 will have the roll number as your 4, NSLA, age, and your mobile number. This is the example of your entity type. And now I will talk about the attribute. I had told each entity have some characteristics. Each entity have some features is called the attributes. And if we will talk about the types of your attribute, so there are so many types of your attribute, like your simple attribute, composite attribute, single valued attributes, key attributes, derived attributes, and your multi valued attributes. First types of attribute is your simple attribute. Another type of attribute is your composite attribute. Another type of attribute is your single valued attribute, key valued attribute, derived attribute, and your multi valued attribute. And I will discuss all types of attribute one by one. First is your simple type attribute. You know, simple type attributes are those attributes which cannot be divided further. If you can't divide it the further, so your attribute will be your simple attribute. Okay. For example, in this given above example, student is your entity, and I had also already told characteristics of your entity is called the attribute. So your student is your entity, and your roll number, class, and your age. These all attributes are the simple attribute, because you can't divide further the roll number, you can't divide further the class, you can't divide it the further age. That's why your roll number, your class, and age, these are your all simple attribute. And now I am talking about the composite attribute. You know, composite attribute are those attributes which are composed of many other simple attributes. Means your composite attributes are those attributes which are composed from the other simple attributes. For example, like your student is your entity, student is your entity, and your roll number, street, city, address, country, state, name, father name, mother name, and your last name is your attributes. Okay, your address is your composite attribute because you can combine the street, city, country, and state in your address. Okay, and also name is your composite attribute because you can combine the simple attribute first name, middle name, and your last name, and after combining your name attribute will make. That's why your name and address are of composite attribute. And if we will talk about the single value attribute, the single value attribute means which can take that only one value for a given entity of an entity set. This is your single valued attribute. For example, your roll number, age, date of birth, and your gender. Roll number have roll number have only one value, age only one value, date of birth only one value, and gender is only one of the value. That's why roll number, age, and date of birth, those are your single value attribute. And if we will talk about the multi-valued attribute, multi-valued attribute are those attributes which can take more than one value. You can see in this image. You can see in this image, roll number is a unique value, age is your unique value, mobile number and email ID. One person can have more than one mobile number. One person can have more than one mail ID. Like I am having the three mail ID. Okay, that's why your mobile number and your employee ID is your multi-valued attribute because your one person can have more than one mobile number. Your one person can have more than one employee ID. That's why your mobile number and your email ID both are multi-valued attribute. And derived attribute. Derived attribute are those attribute which can be derived from the any other attribute. Is called the derived attribute. Derived attribute. Derived attribute means if your attribute will derive from the another attribute, is called the derived attribute. Okay. So your derived attribute means if your one attribute is derived from the another attribute is called the derived attribute. You can see from this slide, student is your entity and your roll number, gender, date of birth, and age both are your attribute. Age, you can derive the age from your date of birth. Your derived attribute is not directly mentioned in your database. Like your date of birth is mentioned in your database, date of birth is your attribute, and date of birth is mentioned in your database. Through the attribute, you can drive the age. That's why your age is your derived attribute, and your derived attribute will always represent in your dashed ellipse. Okay, I had told about the derived attribute. Your derived attribute is not directly present in your database. In this given image, as per I had shown, your date of birth is attribute, and your date of birth is mentioned in your database. But your age is not mentioned in your database. But you can derive the age from your date of birth. That's why your age is your derived attribute. And last is your key attribute. Key attribute are those attributes which can identify an entity uniquely in an entity set. Is called the key attribute. Means key attribute which can identify an entity uniquely in an entity set is called the key attribute. You can understand through this slide roll number, gender, and age. Okay, and through the roll number you can identify a particular entity, particular record, particular person. And after studied this lecture, student will able to what is entity, what is entity type, what is attribute, what is simple attribute, what is single value attribute, what is multi-valued attribute. Means into a student will able to for giving the answer of following short type questions, like as per I had told what is entity. So your entity is your person, or your person and your place and your thing is your entity. And about the entity, your entity will have some characteristics, your entity will have some features. Okay, like your student is your entity, person is your entity, table is your entity, your employee is your entity. Okay, and also types of your entity. Types of your entity means your strong type entity and your big type entity. I had also talked about the weak entity and also talked about the strong type your entity. What is your weak entity? You know about the weak entity. If your one entity is dependent on your another entity, is called the weak entity. Okay. What is your strong entity? If your one entity is not depend on your another entity, it's called the strong entity. And what is attribute? You know, I had told in my lecture in your starting, every entity have some characteristics. Every entity have some features. So your all characteristics and your all features are the attributes. Like your student, student is your entity, and the features of your student, characteristics of your student: name, father name, mother name, course, class, age, state, city, area. So these are the all characteristics of particular student entity. Okay, so these are the all attributes, these are the all columns. When you will make the table, your tables will collection of your fields, and your fields are of your attribute. Okay, and now student also will able to give the answer for what is simple attribute, what are the types of your attributes, what is derived attribute, what is multi-valued attribute, what is your key attribute. Again, I am talking about the important attribute is your derived attribute. Derived attribute is a slightly different, difficult from the other attribute. Your derived attribute is not directly represent in your physical database. Like your age is your attribute and your date of birth is your attribute. Suppose your derived attribute will always represent in your dashed ellipse. Okay, if your date of birth is attribute and date of birth is mentioned in your database, and you want to find the age of your particular employee, so you can find the age of your particular employee through the date of birth. If your date of birth attribute is mentioned in your database, so through this attribute you can find the age. This is very simple. You can subtract from the present date to date of birth, and after perform this operation you can find the age of your attribute. Like your date of birth of your employee is your 79, and your today present date is your 21. So if you will subtract from the 21 to, if you will subtract 17 from your 21, so you can find the age of your employee. And like your multi-valued attribute, like if your attribute have more than one value, is called the multi-valued attribute. And if we will talk about the single value attribute single value attribute means if your attribute have the only one value, it's called the single value attribute. Like your age, okay, is your single value. And if we will talk about the multi-value means which attribute have more than one value, like your multi-valued attribute. For example, email ID, phone number is your multi-valued attribute, because any person can have more than one mobile number, any person can have more than one email ID. That's why your email ID and your mobile number are your multi-valued attribute. And if we will talk about the composite attribute, the composite attribute means when your attribute is divided further, like your name. If we will talk about the name attribute, so you can divide the name, sorry, you can divide the name in your first name, in your middle name, in your second name. Like your, suppose your name is your Ram Kumar Gupta. So your first name is your Ram, your middle name is your Kumar, and your last name is your Gupta. I hope you have understood about your entity and your types. Thank you.